What we saw in 2008 was, I hate to use a cliche, but it was a perfect storm.
There were massive increases in world food prices, mainly in rice and grains. They affected countries all over the world. There were 30 or 40 countries in which riots over food took place, and in several cases governments actually fell. This hadn't been expected by anybody. The G8 nations who were meeting in Japan wondered what the hell was going on. Suddenly this world food crisis had come out of nowhere, and the media was full of speculation as to what was causing it, what was driving it, what was behind it. There was the huge cyclone that hit the Burmese rice crop. There were big droughts going on, there were floods.
We saw not only weird climatic events, but also a government-sponsored solution to climate change, which was biofuels, the process where a large proportion of the US corn surplus was devoted or diverted from food consumption to fuel production.
The world stock market was crashing at the time, was down very low, so speculators and people who normally trade on the markets were looking for something else to invest in.
And all of a sudden, throwing your money into food commodities as speculation was sort of guaranteed a return.
And speculators got into the market, world food prices went through the roof.
The food crisis of 2008 was a wake-up call for me, as it was for many people. I had grown up seeing reports of famines and hunger in one part of the world or another. But in 2008, I was watching a global crisis unfold and began to see another side to hunger. While an additional 80 million people joined the world's hungry, multinational food corporations were making record profits. It seemed like an enormously complex problem with countless causes and impacts. So in early 2008, I began an investigation to uncover what was behind the crisis and understand how the world was going to feed itself in the coming decades. The journey to find answers to these questions took me from my grandparents' lounge room to community gardens in South Africa to chocolate farms in Venezuela. But it started trawling through books and then tracking down their authors to ask questions. I soon discovered that according to many experts, unless there were some major changes, the food crisis of 2008 wouldn't be the last.
You're seeing the beginnings, possibly, of another food crisis because the underlying structural factors really haven't gone away.
These are all little spikes. They're almost like foreshocks before a major earthquake.
Amongst the many reasons given for the long-term crisis in food production, people kept on coming back to soil.
Everything starts with this stuff. Rich, nurtured, loved soil. An agriculture that treats this stuff with respect is an agriculture that builds upon itself. An agriculture that relies on chemicals, on fungicides, on miticides, kills this teeming life. This teeming life support system gets wiped out.
We've lost about 1% of the farmland of the world every single year for the last 25 years. So that's a quarter of the world's farmland gone, out of production.
We say this is a natural disaster. Well, it's not. It's a human-induced land management disaster. We, in 150, 200 years, have effectively mined and degraded the very structure of those soils which underpin their health and their productivity and their resilience.
I went to speak to the farmer in my own family, my grandpa, who had run a farm for many years in New South Wales. It turns out that even 40 years ago, farmers like my grandpa were well aware of the need to look after soil. He bucked the trend and planted trees amongst his crops and pasture as a windbreak and to prevent soil erosion. Despite the knowledge of farmers like my grandpa, it seemed that the environmental problems caused by and affecting agriculture had worsened rather than improved. I wanted to understand how we'd got to this point.
you see the handiwork of scientists. Improved crops, more productive soils, more useful, more efficient machinery. And so a rolling factory gathers together the goodness of nature and does it economically.
Current industrial agriculture has its roots firmly embedded in the post-war period. Industrial food became an exponential project. How can we get more out of the space we have? And to hell with the consequences. With that bigger footprint, it's wiped diversity, which has led to more problems, which leads then to more management of these problems and ultimately the use of more chemical solutions to try and keep an industrial operation moving along.
In a sense, our Western farming system is hooked on these huge inputs of energy and fertiliser.
These boxes join the never-ending parade of food. Food on the move, crisscrossing the country.
Every single consumer in the Western world eats the equivalent of 66 barrels of oil every single year. That's how much we are dependent on oil to make our food.
My research revealed that this model of agriculture was being promoted to parts of the Third World as the only way forward.
That is the dominant model for Western agriculture, and it is the model that is being espoused by the developed world to the developing world. In other words, we're trying our best to hook Indian and Asian and African farmers on oil and fertiliser just when they're both starting to run out.
Now, industrial agriculture is looking to the Third World as an opportunity to gain new addicts.
It was on a trip to Southern Africa in 2009 that I learned that Bill Gates and the Rockefeller Foundation were pouring millions into promoting more productive technologies to African farmers. Some see this as the long overdue solution to Africa's food insecurity, while others fear that it's the Trojan horse that will allow agrochemical companies to gain access to African markets. It seemed to me that the perspective put forward by Bill Gates and co. missed the point that the biggest problems facing the region aren't technological, but are political and economic. People go hungry when they don't have enough money to buy sufficient food, or enough land and resources to grow it. In South Africa, I saw two extremes of the food system. I met a community that had been kicked out of their homes to make way for a supermarket. But I also saw urban garden projects that were helping to bring greater food security to the densely populated townships of Johannesburg, all using organic methods. Back home and inspired by what I had seen, I was keen to get my hands dirty. I started helping out on an organic farm not far from where I live, and began to see how much could be achieved by working with nature, not against it. But all the time I wondered whether this could actually work on a bigger scale. Perhaps high-tech, input and energy-intensive farming was the only way we were going to beat hunger globally.
There was a report very recently published called the International Agricultural Assessment on Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development. It's the sort of report that really you have to be a wonk to read. It's about 5,000 pages long, and it was sort of 400 of the world's top scientists. But the boiled down version is riveting. And what it suggests is that if we're going to feed the world in 2050 when there are 9 billion people, then we'll need other ways of farming than the industrial agriculture that we have today.
But unfortunately, the three big gorillas on the block, the United States, Canada and Australia, gave that report the thumbs down and turned their backs on it.
So how are we going to feed the world in 2050? Well, we'll need different agricultural technologies. We'll need agroecological ways of growing food that are biodynamic, that build ecosystems rather than destroy them. But we'll also need ways of distributing that food. I mean, right now we have more than enough food to feed everyone on Earth, and yet 1 billion people eat less than 1,900 calories a day. So the problem isn't just about the production of food, it's also about the distribution. Imagine an hourglass that's sort of wide at the top and narrow in the middle and wide at the bottom. And at the top, there are the millions of farmers around the world who grow food every day. And at the bottom, the billions of consumers every day who will eat, if they can, every day. But in the middle, it's a narrowing. There are just a few corporations that control the international trade of these food products. And in every major market, there are 4 or 5 corporations that basically run more than half the market.
Farmers are under intense economic pressure. Every farmer in the world is finding the price that they get for their product, whether they're a holder farmer, a poor farmer, or they're a rich farmer in America or Australia or somewhere like that. But they're finding the price of their product is going down and down and down. And the reason for that is that the supermarkets and the big food companies are now concentrating market power in their hands and taking away market power from the farmers.
I was discovering that to meet the challenge of feeding the world in the future, producing enough food and producing it sustainably was only half of the equation.
Yes, we can massively increase our food production physically, but that's not going to solve the problem, because we also have to bring all these social equity, autonomy, access, quality issues in as well, because otherwise we are just perpetuating the same crises that we are now facing.
Looking back over the articles I had collected in 2008, I came across a story that grabbed my attention. While leaders of the world's richest countries met in Japan and defended the free market-based food system, a group of Latin American countries met in Venezuela to discuss a different response, one based on the relatively new concept of food sovereignty. The host nation of Venezuela, better known for its oil exports, was surprising the world with wide-sweeping reforms to its food and agriculture system. I thought the experiment taking place there could hold some of the answers I'd been looking for. Could the process in Venezuela provide an example of how to grow a more fair and sustainable food system on a large scale? Could it show how we might be able to feed the world in the future? Armed with a camera, I headed off to find out. Only a few generations ago, the hillsides around Venezuela's capital, Caracas, were largely unpopulated. But by the end of the 20th century, millions of people filled neighbourhoods that clung to the valley's slopes. In those decades, a long-term food crisis emerged, not dissimilar to the one facing much of the world today. The poor majority struggled to afford enough food. Supply became reliant on imports. And food crises erupted into riots in the streets. I struggled to understand how such a fertile country was ever unable to feed itself. I thought peasant leader José Pineda might be able to explain.
Nosotros éramos una potencia, pues, en lo que era la agroexportación de productos agrícolas. La desgracia, pues, de una economía netamente rentista a raíz de la producción del petróleo, bueno, un poquito tocaba parte atrás de la historia.
Where is Daddy, Mommy?
Daddy is down here in Venezuela. By now, he's down here where the Lake Maracaibo oil fields are.
As we headed out into the lake, I saw that there was no open water ahead, just rows of oil wells. And as an engineer, I know that what I saw is just part of it, that under the water there are hundreds of miles of pipeline.
In the early 1900s, and into the rest of the 20th century, Venezuela became a major oil-producing country. Most of the resource and focus and emphasis of the government and of the powers in this country went to oil production.
It's called the Dutch disease, in which when you discover oil, that takes over and runs the entire economy, and it's no point in growing your own food. You know, because you can import eggs and tomatoes and all those simple things, and even rice, and pasta. You can import it cheaper than what you can grow it. Because it was so cheap to import things, that's what happened, and the whole of agriculture collapsed, virtually collapsed.
En el Estado venezolano existían grandes latifundios, dueños que se encontraban en el extranjero, como la corona inglesa, como grandes corporaciones, y tenían aquí en el Estado tierras ociosas.
These big landowners, they just used to use this ranch for holidays or vacations. They would just maybe build a swimming pool and have birthday parties there. That's what it was used for.
By the middle of the 20th century, Venezuela was the world's largest exporter of oil. Meanwhile, the rural economy was in decline. With fewer jobs in farming and 75% of land controlled by less than 5% of landholders, people headed for the cities in search of better opportunities.
Ustedes vieron en estos días de esa ciudad de Caracas sobrepoblada, eso es fenómeno del latifundio. Esa es parte del éxodo de familias campesinas que fueron sacadas a sangre y fuego, una parte por los terratenientes y por otra parte por las transnacionales norteamericanas y europeas cuando llegaron aquí con las concesiones para sacar el petróleo.
The most rapid urbanisation in Latin America was underway.
They had no access to any housing, public housing, and so they just built their ranchos on top of the hills that you see all around Caracas. People tell me in the 50s the government was so horrified by the ranchos that they produced these postcards and they painted out the ranchos and the mountains and the hills.
Suddenly, we were in the city. I had the driver take me for a ride around the city. He showed me the new sections in the east, where just 10 years ago there were sugarcane and coffee plantations.
Caracas was home to a small elite that had enriched itself from the country's resources, but the majority of its population lived below the poverty line. Where agricultural production did remain, much of it was for export.
Those raw food products were going outside of the country, being sold by intermediaries, and then being processed outside of the country, and then imported back in, which increased the prices for the consumers. It provided less job opportunities.
In the cocoa-producing regions along the Caribbean coast, producers told me how, for decades, global market forces stood over these remote villages.
Los procesos en cuanto a desde la fundación de la hacienda hasta la cosecha tienen mucho trabajo y no fue valorizado. En cuanto a, hablo en esta parte como funcionario, que de repente paralizan la compra para nosotros abarrotarnos de cacao y no poder comprar más, y de repente empiezan a comprar a un bajo precio. O sea, siempre no han hecho ese juego para que, jugando a que esto quiera.
Not far from the cocoa plantations of Tova, I found fisher people who told a similar story of corporate dominance, of its social and environmental consequences.
Y se corta un desequilibrio en el ambiente. El recurso que hay es un recurso finito. Todo la captura que se hace, solamente el 6% de la captura es lo que se puede comercializar. El resto se bota otra vez muerto al mar.
Back in Caracas, and by the late 1980s, the situation was reaching boiling point.
During this time in the 80s, when things were really bad, they couldn't even feed their families of, 1 or 2 children.
Venezuela had been integrated into the global food system, and its poor were feeling the consequences.
The prices of the imported food were relatively high for the vast majority of the population.
People got really desperate in the late 80s, and that explains what happened in 1989 with the Caracazo.
The Caracazo was a mass uprising. It came in the context of the government implementing a set of neoliberal economic reforms designed by the International Monetary Fund. The cost of living went skyward, sparking an outburst of anger. On the 27th of February 1989, the armed forces were used against the people. As many as 3,000 people were killed. Hearing this history from those who had witnessed it, I was struck by the parallels to events in many countries 20 years later. While the Caracazo was about more than just food prices, it shared many long-term causes with the 2008 food crisis. Like many countries today, Venezuela's food system had been gradually eroded. But what happened in Venezuela in the decades following the Caracazo might be seen as a test case, an experiment ahead of its time, whose outcomes and lessons are more relevant now than ever.
People were so tired about the injustice. So I think that was the beginning of this revolution.
I met Jasmine and her partner Louis, who have only recently returned to Venezuela after leaving for the United States in the mid-1990s.
So when I left Venezuela, I left a country with a lot of contrast. They say 80% of poverty.
By the 1990s, most Venezuelans had long since lost faith in the major political parties. But now they were looking for an alternative. When an ex-military officer, Hugo Chavez, ran in the 1998 presidential elections on a platform of eradicating poverty, he captured the imagination of millions. His landslide victory seemed to come out of nowhere, and once in office, his government quickly set about directing more of the country's oil wealth to social programs. Jasmine and Louis returned years later to a very different country. They found public opinion highly polarised over the so-called Bolivarian revolution, now underway.
There are several reasons to bring me here back. The main reason is curiosity. I'm a very curious guy. And I had friends in the two sides of the alley, and I want to know exactly what's going on around here. I think it's a very, very intense and social movement here that try to change things for better. The revolutionary concept is that all of us, we are human beings. We are all equals and we have the same opportunities. And in the past, it was not that way.
A farmer from the Aracal cooperative, Felix Lopez, explained that his son only now had the opportunity to study at university and was on his way to becoming a doctor.
En otro gobierno, hasta el bachillerato, a juro, hasta el quinto año, a juro, de ahí para allá, había que meterse a mafioso a ver, para conseguir los recursos de cómo pagar en una universidad.
Actually, we have free healthcare, free education. And we want the people see around the world that we are the money that we get from the oil is going to give the people the better service like a hair care. Some people say that we are wasting our money, but it's not true. The money is going to the communities.
Not everyone was happy, least of all those who had previously run the oil industry in their interest. Neither were those on the international stage who had promoted privatisation and limited social spending to Latin American countries.
Obviously, Venezuela is important because they're the third largest supplier of petroleum. I would say that Mr. Chavez and the State Department may say this, probably doesn't have the interests of the United States at heart.
In 2002, a US-backed coup attempted to remove Chavez from office and restore the old status quo. But people refused to accept it, bringing Caracas to a standstill for 48 hours until the coup plotters gave in. The poor majority were behind the social process underway and wouldn't again allow the country to be run by Washington's local allies. But basic problems, including access to sufficient food, remained major challenges. Venezuela's food crisis was far from over. What's more, if Venezuela really was going to gain greater political and economic independence, something had to be done about its food system.
As the country is striving for broader sovereignty, food sovereignty is a really critical part of that, because if people don't have control over the land and food producing resources, they really don't have control over their lives.
So food sovereignty was an idea that was hatched in 1995 at the World Food Summit in Rome by a group of farmers that worked together under the banner La Via Campesina. And there are now about 150 million farmers, farm workers, rural labourers and landless people working together under this banner. And food sovereignty was a reaction to food security. Now, food security is the right of people to be able to have access to sufficient food of acceptable quality at all times. But food sovereignty is about control. So it's also, it is about making sure that everyone gets to eat. But the real definition of food sovereignty is that it is about people's and communities' visions and right to be able to shape their food and agriculture policy.
Social movements in Venezuela were beginning to assert that very right. While these movements had long been ignored, now they were empowered and had government support to try to transform the food system. By the time I arrived in Venezuela, this transformation was well underway. The first challenge was to get more land under production and create better opportunities for rural communities. Back at the Aracal cooperative, I could see the results.
Este fondo anteriormente pertenecía a una familia que llegaron cualquier día aquí, se apropiaron de todas estas tierras, fueron sacados los campesinos y empezaron a establecer el monocultivo de la caña de azúcar, donde la producción y la riqueza que daba la tierra iba a una sola familia. Hoy en día no, hoy ya con la recuperación, aquí vemos la diversificación, hay maíz, hay aguacate, hay limón, hay cría de peces en lagunas, hay ganadería. Y todo va pues en una función social a los 150 miembros.
Many of the members of cooperatives like this were previously day labourers with no land of their own. It's part of a process taking place around the country.
There's a law that says that if the land is not being used and it's idle, then the government has the right to expropriate it with full payment, of course, of the value of the land, and to allow peasant families to work that land in order to begin to provide their own food.
By 2009, more than 6 million acres of land had been distributed to 250,000 families. If farmers cultivate the land productively for 3 years, they can gain full ownership. It's not a new issue.
This is a struggle that they've been waging for decades.
But their victories have brought on a violent response.
En la convivencia, pues, las denuncias de los atropellos, de los maltratos de los terratenientes contra los campesinos.
Esto es una guerra sin cuartel. El poder económico lo que busca son los líderes y pagan, se financian a otras personas para que vayan y los maten. Ella estaba cuando le estamos contando la cuestión del compañero que le tirotearon. Él quedó prácticamente inválido luchando 4.200 hectáreas de un español.
Venezuela is not on its own. The majority of the world's poor are rural, and landlessness is a major contributor. Movements for land, like in Venezuela, are building globally.
Other models of land reform are ones where used by, for example, the Brazilian landless rural workers movement. So what happens when people buy land and then just leave it fallow and hope that the value of land will go up? Well, after 7 years in Brazil, they lose the right to that land because the private property is not performing a social function. All of a sudden, people are allowed to occupy that land.
But just having land is definitely not enough.
I went to visit the Pedro Camello Center, one of many places in Venezuela where farmers can go to get support.
Actualmente estamos cerrando la cadena productiva. Tenemos las tierras, tenemos los créditos, tenemos la maquinaria y el acompañamiento. Para que el consumidor final, que es el pueblo, le abaratemos el costo de comida, el costo de producción, sin obtener muchas ganancias, sino simplemente mantenerlo la rentabilidad de cada una de las empresas.
As well as making resources available at places like this, the government helps farmers access low interest or interest-free loans.
Bueno, esa cochinera que está allá, está organizada por un grupo de mujeres. Y la cooperativa le otorga una parte de tierra para que ellos se dediquen, ellos les dan crédito a estas mujeres.
As a result of these efforts, the production of a range of foods has increased, including rice, milk, beans, and some vegetables. Corn is an important staple in Venezuela. Its production has more than doubled since 1998, making the country self-sufficient for the first time in decades. Venezuela has begun to break its reliance on imports. Back at the Pedro Camello Center, I found out it's on land previously held by a large British food company, the Vesti Group. But since being bought back by the government, it's been handed over to hundreds of families. What I saw here seemed to run counter to the conventional wisdom that bigger is better when it comes to the future of farming.
Esta empresa nació con el fin de prestar atención a los pequeños y medianos productores de nuestro campo, que en años anteriores nunca habían sido tomados en cuenta por gobierno alguno y que con la llegada de la revolución a Venezuela los pequeños y medianos productores pasan a ser protagonistas dentro de que es la soberanía agroalimentaria de nuestro país.
The importance of supporting small-scale agriculture had also been impressed on me by Julian Cribb.
1 in 5 human beings in the world is a farmer. And if you put 1 in 5 people out of work, we're going to have a hell of an unemployment problem worldwide. There could be 1.3 billion people out of work if we tried to convert everybody to the Western way of agriculture. Personally, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that smallholder agriculture will continue to thrive because smallholder agriculture is, in its way, very efficient.
Of course, it doesn't matter how efficient a farmer is if there's no market or an unfair market for their produce. So measures are in place to help farmers get a good price.
En las cadenas como Mercal, Fedeval, donde son distribuidas estos alimentos, donde son distribuidos a cielo, a mercado, a campesinos abiertos.
The effort to ensure fairer markets has been critical for the country's cocoa producing communities.
Y ellos nunca hacían caso de la Gaceta, monopolizaban el mercado. Vean la importancia y cómo la transnacional no le llega ni siquiera, te compra el cacao pero no te da ni siquiera ayuda, no te da nada, y apenas esta empresa bolivariana sí te genera créditos institucionales, hay reglas del juego que te permiten ahora denunciar a las personas que paguen menos de ahí.
Sí, aunque la producción ha crecido un poquito y cambiamos un poquito el sueldo, ganamos un poquito más.
Pero eso va en un proyecto social, más allá de la compra, vamos a acompañar, yo soy parte de un equipo.
they're not just exporting their raw goods at a fairer price, which still is nothing compared to the price of a chocolate bar. Their goal here is to have the full capacity to process their chocolate.
Nosotros producimos la materia prima, como es el polvo, licor y la manteca de cacao, para aquella planta que procesa ya directamente chocolate y bombones ya para consumo.
For a country that produces some of the best cocoa in the world, it produces surprisingly little chocolate. The value adding in this process has long been controlled by multinationals. Although most Venezuelan beans are still exported, communities are beginning to take more of the process into their own hands.
Porque lo que hemos hecho es que la empresa no tiene la necesidad de acumular capital. El objetivo es pagar al productor lo máximo que se pueda por su trabajo.
Y ve lo que pasa. Entonces nosotros desde el Estado estamos implementando que el productor sea el partícipe y en realidad que estos procesos les lleguen a ellos y que ellos eleven su calidad de vida.
What I've heard from many chocolate farmers is that often chocolate is looked at as an unhealthy thing, but it's not the actual cocoa, it's how it's produced and all the additives that are added into the chocolate that most of us eat. So if we're able to find new, healthier ways to use the chocolate, and that's being done here in Venezuela, and their priority is domestic needs.
With the growing interest in fair trade in the West, even companies like Cadbury have released a fair trade range. But what I saw here was an altogether more genuine and holistic approach to fair trade.
Esta fue una planta la cual solicitaron en muchas reuniones los productores de cacao.
El mecanismo es que cada 21 días hay una asamblea. A esa asamblea asisten los voceros de los consejos comunales y se discuten las políticas a desarrollar por la empresa y una de esas políticas tiene que ver con la compra del grano de cacao.
La asamblea, incluso como son productores e hijos de productores los que trabajan en esta planta.
Most of what I'd heard about Venezuela from the mainstream media at home centred on the controversial Chavez. But what I was beginning to see here is that while the government was involved with many of these projects, a lot of the change was being driven by and controlled by communities.
I think the food system is becoming more democratic on a number of levels. There are community councils who have been sanctioned really to monitor their food needs, monitor what food is coming into the community, how much it costs, what the quantities are, how consistent it is, what the quality is.
Los consejos comunales es la figura organizativa y de toma de decisiones dentro de la comunidad de Chihuahua. Y ellos son la máxima autoridad en todo el pueblo.
Porque en el Consejo Comunal soy de la Casa de Energía y Alimentación. O sea, tengo que ver con lo que es alimentación, cada quien sus cosas. Y me gusta atender a mi pueblo, lo que sea de todo de aquí.
Communal councils are made up of between 150 and 400 families, or about 20 families in rural areas. Over 25,000 councils now exist around the country.
They're also building relationships. For instance, community councils in the city working directly with farmers' councils in the countryside to have community markets.
This sort of community power had also brought about some major changes for fishing communities.
Mi nombre es Julio César Moreno, Rabbit, vocero por el Frente Nacional de Pescadores Artesanales. Todas las comunidades están organizadas en consejos de pescadores.
Here in Chihuahua, they're fixing the fishing nets ready to head out to sea.
nosotros dentro de la ley de pesca tenemos un artículo el cual elimina en toda la plataforma continental nuestra la pesca industrial y arrastre.
Even though the effort that we put in to catch it, of modern fishing trawlers and huge fishing fleets, millions and millions of boats, is growing every single year. So we're making more effort and we're catching less fish. Something like a third of the fish stocks worldwide have already collapsed. Another 40% are at risk.
Ahora, bajo esa ley, se protege al pescador y también se protegen los peces.
The greater regulation of fishing is about distributing access to Venezuelan waters that were long dominated by large-scale fishing, much of it for export. It's a policy that's been applauded by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Julio explained that national fish production has increased since the changes were introduced. But after a slow month, Julio's hopes are high that today's catch will make up for it.
Y nosotros, tanto los pescadores artesanales como el gobierno nacional, queremos de que las próximas generaciones también puedan disfrutar de ese recurso.
But if farmers and producers were getting a better deal, I wondered if consumers were paying for it. I headed for the city to see the other end of the food chain.
One of the most successful policies that has implemented the government is about food security, food sovereignty.
Anteriormente no se controlaba del todo ese aspecto y no aseguraban lo que era el abastecimiento nacional. En el 2007-2008 surge la Ley de Soberanía Agroalimentaria, donde las transnacionales están obligadas a cubrir primero el mercado interno para luego exportar.
You have a chain of store which name is Mercado, and they provide it with better price to the people.
They wanted to subsidise food to people, the poorest sections of the community who couldn't afford to eat.
There are now around 16,000 Mercal outlets around the country, providing food around 40% below regular prices.
Antes en Chuao había gente que comía una sola vez, y te comía era plátano y pescado. No te sabía de arepa, de pasta, de carne, pollo, eso era un lujo, leche. Adiós lo que te olvidaste. Hoy en día tenemos un mercado que nos suple todas las semanas de todos los alimentos, porque tienes todos los nutrientes, tienes acceso a todos los nutrientes. Antes no.
Hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans receive meals each day from public food houses and workplace kitchens. Malnutrition has fallen from 21% to 6% in the past decade. But the picture I got definitely wasn't a perfect one. With all the programs in place for people to access food, farmers are struggling to keep up. So at the same time as domestic production has increased, so too have imports. But faced with a test like the 2008 global food crisis, it seemed Venezuela could pass without the hunger experienced by many of its neighbours. Alongside these chains, there's a growing network of alternative distribution channels.
There's support for community markets where farmers are able to sell their products directly to community members. And while those are supported by the government, it's very much managed by farmers and by community councils.
As Costa explained to me back home, this is part of a growing change globally.
This commodification of food by industrial agriculture has created a chasm between the grower and the consumer. And now there's a change. People want to close that gap in.
I think the measures that are being put into effect now are really diversifying the channels that food goes through to get from the producers to the consumers.
This small vegetable stall in the middle of Caracas is one such channel.
Por ejemplo, esta lechuga en los supermercados comunes vale 20 bolívares, 16, aquí nosotros la vendemos a 8, o sea, al costo de producción. precios más accesibles. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros saltamos en la cadena productiva del productor al consumidor. Entonces no pasamos los intermediarios, que son los que le incrementan el precio a los productos.
Just behind the stall is the urban garden that keeps it stocked with fresh produce.
Falta más que todo una motivación y que la gente entienda de que qué es lo necesario y qué es necesario producir en la ciudad, en los campos, en todos los espacios para alcanzar la soberanía. Ya estamos entrando en una etapa de que hay seguridad pero no hay soberanía.
As well as paid staff, unemployed workers from nearby neighbourhoods can work in the garden and take home vegetables. It's one of dozens of urban gardens that are taking over unused spaces around the city, including between busy roads.
Hace ya más o menos, a partir de casi 7 meses que tomamos estos espacios, hemos ido, aquí no había nada, hemos ido poco a poco cultivando productos que sirven para el autoconsumo y también los excedentes, llevarlos a ciertas comunidades también necesitadas de forma solidaria, totalmente gratuito.
La mayoría de estas personas conocen de producción agrícola, porque ellos se vinieron del interior del país o de las zonas rurales a buscar una mejor vida, ¿verdad? Pero aquí se descontrola, aquí perdieron, se desviaron del camino que vinieron a buscar. Esta actividad los reintegre de nuevo a su espacio de origen.
Perhaps the most innovative projects I saw were in urban aquaculture.
La producción que aquí se obtenga va destinada a las personas más vulnerables de la comunidad, las personas más pobres que están acá llamadas.
This was the first community aquaculture project of its kind, but they can already be found in a dozen neighbourhoods around Caracas. The government is supporting these projects and has set the goal of 1,000 hectares of gardens like these in the country's urban areas.
Quite recently I've visited a number of farms on the periphery of the capital that are quite productive. They have composting systems, they have natural forms of pest control. I think really supporting urban agricultures in the cities and around cities is another strategy. It's one of these many prongs as we're working to diversify the channels of food production. And I think it's also important to give people a connection to food.
When I met Costa in a community garden in Sydney, the parallels to the situation at home were very clear.
Small-scale operations such as community gardens are not as far-fetched as it may seem to providing food for a city. Spare plots of land can provide simple elements of our day-to-day food that then don't require being grown by our commercial farmers, so they can be freed up to grow other things.
I think one of the most wondrous challenges is to create permaculture in cities. In other words, to make cities integrated entities that recycle nutrients, energy and water.
Los principios de agricultura urbana, lo que estamos aplicando es la elaboración de compost y aplicación de materia orgánica libre de químicos. O sea, todos los desechos que antiguamente se botaban se elaboran y se utilizan en el bien de la producción. Naturales todo, nada químico, todo natural.
The growing consciousness around how food is produced goes well beyond the city.
Entendiendo el gran daño porque le causó la agricultura convencional, la agricultura corporativa a la tierra, decidimos pues empujar en lo que es el control biológico y la agroecología, pues la agricultura ancestral campesina.
Most of the farms I visited had large worm farms providing rich fertilizer.
El estiércol y todo tipo de desechos de descomposición de forraje, o sea,
maleza, plantación de cambur, lo que queda de, por lo menos aquella parte que está allá, todo lo que se descomponga lo utilizamos.
La idea es buscar alternativas para mejorar las condiciones del suelo. Vamos a rotar ahorita maíz con leguminosas, soya y frijol negro. Y con la deposición de esta materia vegetal disminuimos un pequeño porcentaje el uso de fertilizantes químicos. Igual como nos ayuda a controlar la maleza, evitamos la aplicación de productos químicos. Y es por eso que ahorita está en proyecto ya la realización de un laboratorio de controladores biológicos dentro de la unidad.
There are now some 24 so-called biolabs around the country, producing beneficial insects, fungi and biofertilizers. The biofertilizers involve microbes that release nutrients out of the soil. There are also seed banks that help preserve the diversity of locally adapted plant varieties. Agroecology has been incorporated into national agricultural policy, which also mandates the phasing out of toxic agrochemicals. But progress in some areas has been slow.
As the people and the government are striving to produce as much food nationally as possible, the priority is to get that food produced. So you still see a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and machinery, but at the same time there's a lot of really important initiatives.
One initiative has been the establishment of a national school of agroecology in conjunction with La Via Campesina. I visited the school and spoke to some of the students.
Bueno, nosotros cuando llegamos a las comunidades, hay veces que hay algunos campesinos que ya están demasiado acostumbrados con los químicos que nos dicen no podemos meternos a la agroecología porque sería pérdidas para nosotros en las cosechas. Pero con nuestras experiencias y como lo decía la compañera, cuando elaboramos los abonos, cuando le demostramos, porque a veces hemos traído campesinos a ver nuestra parcela que tenemos aquí, que es netamente agroecológica y ellos se dan cuenta que la producción es buena. Entonces se han convencido.
Con la unión con los campesinos, trabajando con ellos, creo que podremos lograr la producción, la soberanía alimentaria aquí en Venezuela, orgánicamente, sin estar dependiendo de ninguna transnacional que nos venga a implementar su paquete tecnológico.
But Raj Patel has reservations about Venezuela's environmentalism.
I think this is Venezuela's great curse, is that by having such access to cheap fossil fuel, the imagination to shift towards a zero-carbon economy is lacking in some ways.
Extemporánea, que si no la reinvertimos, un poco lo que decía el maestro Libertad Prieto Figueroa, de que había que sembrar el petróleo para asegurar la seguridad alimentaria del país y de las generaciones futuras.
They recognise that it's a perverse economy. I read a speech by Chavez just the other day in which he said their oil economy is totally perverse, and it's true.
So they're trying to use the construction of a new food system as an economic vehicle and to be able to diversify their industries. The idea is that eventually this agricultural system is going to be self-sustaining.
The question of oil dependency is one of a host of challenges that Venezuela is facing in the transition to food sovereignty. My time in Venezuela was coming to an end. If I'd come here looking for a utopia, I'd have been disappointed. But I'd come to see a process. I was reminded of this back in Chihuahua, where the fishing community and cocoa producers continue to organise for a fair and sustainable food system.
Son lo que se llama el poder popular. Jala la morcha. No, ahí, déjalo ahí. No, déjalo ahí, ok. Ahí. Amarra ahí, compadre.
think the main lessons that countries like the US and Australia and others can learn from Venezuela is, to put it most simply, that where there's a will, there's a way. I think Venezuela has had a lot of factors against it. Very high levels of imports, very high levels of poverty, land that was concentrated in the hands of a few, and yet they're doing it. They're doing it because there's a real desire on the part of the people and a determination, and at the same time there's real support at the national level.
On the flight home, I was brought back to reality. The in-flight magazine carried an ad from Monsanto promising the solutions to feed the world. But I'd seen in Venezuela that there's no technological fix to the food crisis.
Sustainable and permanent agriculture requires a change in thinking, and it requires a change in systems. Food security is a political issue. We need to set the agenda of how we want to see our food production.
We need a sort of combination approach of certainly of shifting our consumption habits, but we're not going to change the world just by shopping. And I think that if we're serious about activism and transformation, we need to move away from the idea of merely shopping right and then patting ourselves on the back and going home, and thinking much more about how it is that we can act as citizens.
Entonces nosotros invitamos a toda que vea este video, que lo invitamos a que haga su huerto en la casa, que construya su mesita de 1.20, no importa, lo importante es que todos podemos sumar a esta gran campaña para cuidar el planeta, para salvar el planeta.
Through a combination of activism, through a combination of the flourishing of local food movements, through political change and organising, that we will have a sort of dual thing of the rise of the local food movement and the demise of this industrial corporate alternative.
Growing a fair and sustainable food system, whether in countries like Venezuela or Australia, requires social movements and social change. It requires a model that sees food as more than a commodity. I hadn't come back with a recipe for this change, but definitely with ideas about the ingredients.